The wind came down from the mountains that night like a living thing, cold enough to split bark, fierce enough to strip the color from the sky. Eli Tanner had seen 40 winters, but none that felt so heavy on the bones. He moved slow through the yard, coat collar turned up, lantern swinging in one hand, a shovel in the other. The snow was coming early this year, hard and gray, pushing through the juniper hills like a tide that refused to quit. He'd fixed the gate hinge earlier that day, fed the horses, split kindling till dusk bled out behind the ridgeline. Everything on his land ran by habit now. Habit was safe. Habit didn't speak, didn't question, didn't remember. The only voices left were the wind in the cottonwoods and the old boards creaking in the barn. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee grounds and ash. 2 chairs stood by the fire, one always empty. Eli didn't sit in that one anymore. He'd kept it as it was, the way Martha left it the spring the fever took her. The shawl she used to wear was still folded over the backrest, a soft echo of color in a room gone gray. He poured coffee, strong and black, and stared out through the frost-fogged window. Nothing moved out there except snow. Nothing ever did, not this far from town. Then, a sound, distant, faint, like a cry carried wrong by the wind. He stepped onto the porch, heart tightening against the cold. The sound came again, not a coyote, not wind, human, weak. He grabbed the lantern and moved toward the corral, boots crunching through hard snow, breath fogging thick as smoke. She was there, half collapsed against the fence post, wrapped in nothing but torn cloth and blood. The lantern light caught her face, young, sharp-boned, dark as burnt cedar. Her hair hung in tangled braids matted with ice, barefoot, eyes closed. God almighty, Eli muttered. He set the lantern down and knelt. Her skin was burning with fever. He pressed his hand near her throat. Pulse faint, but there. Whoever she was, she'd run far. He looked toward the ridge. No riders, no tracks. Just snow swallowing everything. Can you hear me? He asked, voice low, unused to speaking. She stirred, a whisper that wasn't English. Eli didn't think. He just moved, lifted her into his arms, light as a sack of grain, and carried her toward the cabin. The storm clawed harder, tearing at his coat, trying to pull her away. By the time he kicked the door open, his hands were shaking from cold and something else he hadn't felt in years. Fear, or maybe purpose. He laid her by the hearth, peeled away the frozen cloth, and fetched the kettle from the stove. The smell of smoke and wet leather filled the room. Her shoulder bore a shallow wound, not from the storm but from a knife or bullet. He cleaned it with whiskey and bound it in torn linen. She never woke, just murmured softly in her tongue, eyes flickering under lids. Eli poured a bit of coffee between her lips, careful not to spill. A hand twitched, fingers curling toward the cup like a child reaching for warmth. Easy now, he said. You're safe here. The words felt strange leaving his mouth, like they belonged to someone else. Outside, the storm howled till near dawn. Inside, he kept the fire alive, dozing in the chair beside her. Each time she stirred, he'd glance over to be sure she was still breathing. The hours stretched long, filled with crackling logs and the ticking of snow against the windows. When morning came, the world outside was white and hollow. Eli stepped out to the porch and breathed in the cold, his breath rising like smoke from a dying fire. No tracks, no pursuit. Whoever hunted her, the storm had buried their trail. He stayed close to the cabin all day, chopping wood in the yard, glancing toward the window every few minutes. By dusk, he heard movement inside, the chair scraping against the floor. He stepped in quietly. She was awake, sitting near the fire, blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. Her eyes, dark, sharp, and still, found him the moment he entered. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, she said something. One word, soft and rough-edged, almost swallowed by the crackling logs. He didn't understand, but the tone carried gratitude. Or warning. Maybe both. I ain't gonna hurt you, Eli said. His voice came out rough as gravel. You were near dead out there. She studied him, not trusting, not frightened, just watchful. He noticed then that one braid had come loose, hanging long down her shoulder. The end was singed, blackened, as if burned by fire. He nodded toward her wound. "You'll need rest. I'll bring broth." When he turned to go, she spoke again, halting English this time. "Why, help?" Eli paused. The question struck deeper than it should have. He didn't answer right away, because no one else would have come. That night he slept little. The wind had gone, leaving only silence, a silence that pressed in on the walls. He could hear her shifting by the fire, could smell the faint scent of smoke and herbs. It was strange having another heartbeat under his roof again. Strange and heavy. By morning, the world had begun whispering. The mail rider from Santo Vele came late, shoulders hunched against the cold. He dropped the post on Eli's porch, gave one look through the open door at the faint figure by the hearth, and froze. "That an Indian woman you got in there, Tanner?" he asked, eyes narrowing. Eli didn't answer. "Just took the parcel and shut the door. Word would spread. It always did." Santo Vale was a small town with big ears, and a white rancher harboring an Apache woman would set tongues wagging faster than prairie fire. There'd be talk of savagery, of sin, of danger. Men like Benson, ranchers with rifles and empty hearts, would see it as a reason to come calling. Eli poured 2 cups of coffee that night. Set one by the fire beside her bedroll. She didn't drink it right away, but her hand brushed the mug in passing. A small thing, but to him, it felt like the first thaw of spring under all that snow. He sat in his chair, staring into the fire until his eyes blurred. Outside, the frost grew thick on the window glass, and the sound of coyotes carried across the hills. He didn't know her name. Didn't know who had hurt her or why she'd been running. All he knew was that she had looked at him, not with gratitude, not even with trust, but with life. And for the first time in years, Eli Tanner felt something stir in the ashes of his chest. Not warmth, not yet, but the memory of it. The thaw came slow that week, not from the sun but from the hearth. Each morning the frost clung stubborn to the fence rails, the breath of the horses rising pale against the sky. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and the woman he'd saved began to live again. She woke fully on the 3rd morning, her eyes clearer, her skin no longer ash-gray. Eli was at the table, patching a torn glove with twine and silence when he heard her voice for the first time, soft, uncertain. "Nalin," she said, tapping her chest lightly. "Nalin," he looked up. "That your name?" She nodded once. Then, after a pause, she added something in her own tongue, a word that rolled like river water, gentle and far away. She searched for the English, then said, "Water." "In the desert," Eli set the glove aside. "That's a good name." She watched the steam curl from his coffee cup, her gaze following it as if trying to remember what warmth meant. Over the next few days, she found her footing in his world, quietly, like someone who'd learned the hard way to move unseen. She would wake before him sometimes, already tending the fire, her braid hanging loose over one shoulder. The smell of burning oak and boiling water filled the cabin before the light did. When she spoke, her English came haltingly, patched together from memory and mercy. Still, Eli learned enough, fragments of a story she didn't want to tell. A raid, men with rifles, fires in the canyon, her people scattered into the mountains. Hunted like coyotes, and a name she spoke with venom and pain both. Benson. Eli knew that name. Every rancher for 50 miles did. William Benson and his hired guns had taken more than land. They'd taken freedom. They'd forced Eli once too when he was younger and poorer, to sell half his herd and sign papers under a rifle barrel. He'd carried that shame in silence ever since. He didn't tell her any of that. But he saw something in her eyes that mirrored what lived in his own, that hollow space where trust used to be. He taught her simple things, not because she needed them, but because it gave them both something to hold on to. "How to grind coffee," he said one morning, showing her how the old mill worked. She watched the beans crush beneath the iron teeth, breathing in the smell with quiet wonder. "Smells like thunder," she said, and he almost smiled. Later she helped mend the fence, her hands sure, movements precise. The first time she handled a hammer, he noticed the scars across her palms, thin and silvery. She didn't hide them, and he didn't ask. They worked side by side till sundown, their shadows long and even across the snow-dusted field. At night, she sat near the hearth, combing out her braid, humming low songs that sounded like prayers made of wind. Eli would sit at the table, polishing his old rifle or pretending to read. Sometimes she'd glance his way, as if to measure the silence between them. On the 5th night, she found the shawl. He came in from the barn and saw her standing by the chair, the shawl draped over her shoulders, its faded rose threads catching the firelight. She must have found it folded there earlier, the one thing of Martha's he'd never moved. For a heartbeat, something sharp twisted in him. Memory or guilt, he couldn't tell. But the sight didn't wound him the way he expected. It softened him instead. The shawl belonged to his wife once, yes, but now it looked different, alive again, warmed by someone who still breathed. It's pretty, Nalin said softly, careful with the English. He nodded, throat tight. It was hers. Nalin touched the edge of the fabric, as if asking permission to keep it there for a while. He said nothing, just turned back to the stove and poured coffee, the same way he did when he couldn't trust his own voice. Rain came that night, soft at first, then steady. It pattered against the roof like 1,000 small secrets. The wind dropped low, and the smell of wet earth drifted through the gaps in the walls. Nalin sat cross-legged by the fire, watching the flames bend. "Your woman," she said suddenly, the words slow but clear. "She gone long?" Eli didn't move for a while. The question hung in the air, not unkind, just open. 3 years come spring, he said finally. "Fever took her and our boy," Nalin's eyes lowered. "My people say, when fire takes breath, spirit still walks." "She here?" Eli glanced at the empty chair beside him, the shawl's old resting place. "Sometimes," he said, in the quiet. They didn't speak again for a long time. Only the rain did. Soft, endless, honest. When he looked at her again, her eyes were closed, the shawl still wrapped tight. The firelight flickered across her face, and for the first time he saw not the hunted woman from the snow, but someone simply resting, a rare thing in this world. He thought about the things that never left a man. The smell of his wife's hair, the echo of a child's laugh, the weight of loneliness that hung on him like wet wool. He wondered what Nalin carried, what faces haunted her dreams, what names she whispered to the dark. Outside, thunder rolled far off in the hills. Inside, the cabin breathed slow, the rhythm of 2 lost souls sharing warmth against the cold. Later that night, Eli stood by the door, watching the rain streak down the glass. His reflection wavered, half there, half gone, like the man he'd become. Behind him, the firelight painted her silhouette against the wall. Her braid a black ribbon down her back, the shawl glowing faint rose in the light. It struck him then that the house didn't feel as empty anymore. The silence had changed its shape. It wasn't absence now. It was something waiting to be understood. He sat back down, poured himself another cup of coffee, and watched the rain until it softened into sleep. Somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, the world shifted, not loudly, not fast. But sure as dawn, the ghosts in the room did not vanish. They simply made room for 2 more living hearts. The sky began to turn the color of iron before noon. A hard wind blew out of the west, lifting dust and dead leaves from the draws, pushing them in slow spirals across the yard. The air held that uneasy stillness that comes before a storm, heavy, expectant, the kind that makes horses restless and men remember prayers. Eli Tanner felt it in his bones before he saw it in the sky. Storms came fast this time of year, rolling down from the mountains like judgment. He'd checked the fences that morning, mended the feed shed door, but his hands kept drifting to his rifle propped by the porch. Habit. Or maybe instinct. Inside, Nalin moved quietly as always, tending the fire, setting a pot to boil, the shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The world outside had started to roar, but her face was calm. She had the look of someone who'd lived through worse weather than this. By mid-afternoon, the first fat drops began to fall, cold, hard, and scattered. Eli was stacking firewood near the porch when he heard the distant rattle of hooves. He turned, squinting through the rain, and saw a single rider pushing through the curtain of dust and water. "Stay inside," he called to Nalin through the doorway. Then he stepped out to meet whoever had come. The rider dismounted slow, water running from the brim of his hat. Sheriff Grady, gray mustache, oilskin coat, eyes that never stayed still. "Afternoon, Tanner," he said, voice roughened by years of smoke and sand. "Storm's coming down hard. Figured I'd best stop here before the road washes out." Eli nodded. "You can wait it out if you like." Grady hesitated before stepping up onto the porch. "Heard some talk in town," he said finally. "Don't much care for it, but I reckon you ought to know." Eli's jaw tightened. "Go on." "Word is, you've been keeping company with a woman out here. Apache. Folks say she's living under your roof." Rain hit the porch roof in sudden bursts, loud enough to make them pause. "She was half dead when I found her," Eli said evenly. "I couldn't just leave her to die." "I know that," Grady said. "Hell, most folks would have done the same. But Benson's boys been riding their mouths in town, claiming that woman was part of the raiders who hit their camp last fall. They're itching for trouble, Tanner. You keep her here and you'll find it." Eli's eyes hardened. "Benson's men don't need reason for trouble. They make their own." Grady sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I'm telling you this as a friend. Send her off before it brings hell to your door." Thunder cracked across the hills, close enough to shake the boards underfoot. Grady looked toward the sky, rain streaming off his hat brim. "You always were too stubborn for your own good," he muttered. Then he climbed into the saddle and disappeared into the gray, the storm swallowing him whole. Eli stood for a long moment, the rain soaking through his coat. When he went back inside, Nalin was standing by the window, her face pale in the flickering light. "Man talk loud," she said softly. "He say I must go?" Eli didn't answer right away. He hung up his coat, wiped the water from his face. "He said this storm will bring hell with it," he said finally. Her eyes lowered. "Then I go before it comes," he turned to her sharply. "You'll do no such thing." But she was already gathering her things, the small bundle she kept under the cot, her braid tied back with a leather cord. Her movements were steady, resolved. "You took me in," she said. "Now men come." "I bring danger." "Better I walk alone." Eli felt something inside him snap, not in anger, but in desperation. "You step out in that storm, you won't make it a mile." She met his eyes then, and for the first time he saw fear there. Not of the weather, not even of death, but of being the reason someone else suffered again. He stepped closer. The lantern light carved deep shadows across his face. "You're staying," he said quietly. "This is my land." "My fight." For a long breath, neither moved. The storm roared against the roof like a wild thing, wind shoving at the shutters, rain hissing through every crack. The fire guttered low. Then Nalin slowly set down her bundle and sank to her knees by the hearth. "You foolish man," she whispered. Not cruelly, almost tender. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. As the night deepened, the wind screamed through the eaves, tearing loose a shingle or two. Eli shoved a chair under the door latch, then sat across from her, boots dripping, hat in his lap. They said little. There wasn't much to say. Words would have been too small against the sound of thunder. At one point, lightning lit up the whole room, bright as day, showing her face turned toward the window, the scar at her temple shining pale. The next instant, darkness returned, soft and golden with firelight. She spoke then, voice almost lost in the wind. "When sky angry, my people say it wash away bad spirits. Maybe this storm. Take them from us." Eli stared into the flames. "I reckon we both got plenty worth washing." She gave a faint, broken smile. "Then we wait." They waited. Hours passed, long, breathless stretches where the world seemed nothing but wind and thunder and firelight flickering over wood and skin. The storm beat its fury against the cabin, but inside there was something steady, immovable. At one point, the door rattled hard enough to shake the hinges. Eli rose to brace it, but Nalin was already there beside him, pressing her shoulder against the wood. Their hands met briefly on the latch, rough fingers, cold from the draft. The touch was nothing and everything. When the wind eased a little, he turned toward her, close enough to see the glint of fire reflected in her eyes. "You should get some rest," he murmured. She shook her head. "Can't sleep." Storm inside, too, he understood. There were storms that never made sound, only lived behind the ribs. Sometime near dawn, the wind began to die, leaving only rain, soft, steady, forgiving. The fire had burned low to embers. Nalin sat slumped near the hearth, the shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, eyes half closed. Eli rose quietly and laid another log on the fire. The flame caught, lighting her face in gold and shadow. He stood there a long while, watching her breathe, watching the rain streak down the window like tears neither of them could cry. When she finally stirred, her voice was soft. "Why you help me again?" Eli's answer came slow, as if carved from something old and buried. "Because I'd rather fight the storm than lose another soul to it." She didn't speak again. She didn't have to. Outside, the world began to pale with dawn, a new light breaking through the clouds, weak but sure. Inside, the air was still thick with the scent of smoke and rain. The storm had passed, but something in them had changed. Not broken, not healed, just shifted, like earth settling after a long tremor. They hadn't touched beyond that brief moment at the door, but in the quiet that followed, both understood something wordless. They were no longer alone. When the storm finally broke, the world seemed reborn, washed clean, shining under a pale sky. The air smelled of wet cedar and ash. Every hollow in the land brimmed with rainwater, and the earth, cracked for months, drank deep. Eli Tanner stood on the porch, boots sinking into the soft mud, watching the last of the clouds drift east. His house, though battered, still stood. The roof leaked in 2 spots, and the north fence had gone under, but it was nothing he hadn't mended before. What he couldn't mend was the silence that hung between him and the woman inside. Nalin moved through the house like she belonged there, quiet, deliberate, and untouchable. She had taken to working without being asked. When Eli rose in the morning, she was already awake, brewing coffee in his old tin pot. She swept the floor, scrubbed the hearth, and mended what she could find. A broken strap, a splintered chair leg, the torn lining of his coat. At first, he tried to stop her. "You don't have to," he'd said. But she only looked at him, eyes calm and unreadable. Doing keeps ghosts away, so he let her. Days stretched in strange peace, the kind that feels too fragile to last. The storm had passed, but it left something behind. Between them lingered a tension like the faint hum of a live wire, unseen but constant. He worked the fields. She worked the house. Sometimes, at dusk, he'd find her outside, standing barefoot on the damp porch, face lifted to the wind as if listening for something far away. The shawl hung from her shoulders, her hair loose now, dark against the silver light. He didn't speak then. He only watched from the yard, the quiet filling the space between them more completely than words ever could. On the 3rd morning, she asked for rope. "What for?" Eli said, glancing up from the saddle he was oiling. Her hands moved in practiced rhythm, fingers twisting strands of rawhide she'd found in the shed. "You tie horses," she said. "I make better one." He handed her the spool, curiosity rising. She sat cross-legged on the porch floor, braiding with quick, sure motions, the same kind of precision he'd seen once in Apache beadwork traded down at the post. "Your people use patterns for meaning," he said. Half to himself, she nodded, still working. "Every braid tells a story. This one," she paused, looking up at him, "for strength that bends, but does not break." He watched her a long moment, the light catching on her fingers. "Reckon I could use that kind of rope." A small smile touched her mouth, gone as quick as it came. That afternoon, they worked side by side, repairing the rocking chair his father had made. The back had split clean through during the storm. Eli fetched nails and glue. Nalin steadied the frame. The sound of hammering echoed softly in the small room, rhythmic, almost soothing. When the chair finally stood whole again, Eli stepped back. "Didn't think it'd ever rock again." She brushed a fleck of sawdust from the seat. "Old things live long if cared for." The words hung between them. For a moment, neither moved. Then the chair creaked. Slow, mournful, like memory itself settling back into place. By evening, smoke rose from the chimney. She had cooked venison stew and cornbread. He ate quietly, grateful for warmth and company, though neither spoke much. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of rain-damp wood and stew. When she reached across the table to pass him a cup of coffee, her fingers brushed his. Just a touch, but it stopped time. Both froze. The sound of their breathing filled the space. Shallow, quick. Her hand lingered a second too long before she pulled it back. "Thank you," he murmured. She nodded, eyes downcast. But her pulse flickered at her throat like a trapped bird. The rest of the meal passed in silence. Outside, twilight gathered slow. The first stars broke through the clouds. Eli stepped out to the porch, mug in hand, watching the horizon fade from blue to black. Behind him, he heard the soft creak of the newly mended rocking chair. She had taken his place there, shawl around her shoulders, hair loose over one side. "You fix it better than I could have," he said. "It wanted to be whole," she answered, rocking gently. The motion was slow, rhythmic, a heartbeat against the hush of night. He leaned on the post, studying her in the lamplight that spilled through the window. "You ever think of leaving? Heading back to your people?" Her rocking slowed. "My people think me dead. Spirit gone with smoke." The words hit him like a weight he couldn't lift. "You're not dead," he said quietly. She looked at him then. Truly looked. "Maybe not. But world treats me same," the chair creaked. An old voice speaking between them. The next day, trouble came. Eli was splitting logs when he saw them. 2 riders on the ridge above the creek, silhouettes against the sun. Benson's men, watching. He didn't move, didn't call out. Just leaned on the axe handle, eyes fixed on them until they turned their horses and rode off slow, dust trailing behind. That night, he said nothing about it. But his rifle stayed near the door. Word reached him a few days later. Grady again, passing through on his rounds. "Benson's been talking," the sheriff warned. "Says you've gone soft. Says you're bewitched by that Apache woman." Eli didn't look up from his work. "Benson's always talking. Ain't never said a thing worth listening to." Grady sighed. "Just keep your eyes open. They're riding drunk and stupid lately. That's when men do their worst." When he left, the quiet returned, thicker than before. That night, Eli found Nalin sitting near the fire, mending his coat where the sleeve had torn. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. "You hear what they're saying in town?" he asked. "I hear wind," she replied simply. He sat opposite her, the flames throwing gold across their faces. "You shouldn't have to live like this, hiding from men who don't even know your name." She looked up, eyes catching the light. "You hide too. From your ghosts." The truth of it struck him deep. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but his throat closed around the words. So they sat in silence, 2 souls bound by what they couldn't undo. The fire popped, the rocking chair creaked, the wind whispered through the cracks like an old prayer. Outside, the night stretched endless and still. Inside, the air trembled with something neither dared name, not fear, not yet love, but the fragile space between. And in that fragile space, something living began to take root. The first sign came with the wind, hot, unnatural, carrying the smell of smoke long before the sky turned red. Eli Tanner lifted his head from the corral and felt it in his bones, trouble riding in on the night air. By the time he reached the ridge, he saw it, fire crawling like a living thing across the north field. Flames snapping through dry grass, devouring fence posts, leaping from one juniper to the next. The blaze painted the land in savage light, turning the horizon into a line of fury. "Benson," Eli muttered. No question. The kind of cruelty that burned for sport had his signature written all over it. He ran for the pump, shouting for water. Nalin was already there, barefoot, shawl thrown aside, hair loose and whipping in the wind. Without hesitation, she filled the first bucket, hands trembling only from the cold. "Stay back," Eli ordered, but she was already moving toward the fire. "No," her voice was clear, certain. "We fight." There was no time for argument. He grabbed a shovel. She carried buckets. and together they plunged into the choking smoke. The night turned into chaos, the hiss of water against flame, the scream of wood splitting, the thunder of wind driving sparks like bullets. The air seared their throats. Sweat and soot ran together down their faces. Eli's coat caught once, a lick of fire biting at his sleeve until Nalin beat it out with her bare hands. He yelled something, a warning, maybe her name, but the wind tore it away. For an hour, they fought side by side, two silhouettes against the inferno, moving in instinctive rhythm. When he shoveled dirt to smother the edge, she was already there with another bucket. When her strength flagged, his hand steadied hers. No words, no thought, just survival, shared and wordless. When at last the fire began to die, its fury spent, they stood together in the blackened field, chest to chest, gasping in the smoke-thick air. It was then that the hooves came. From the darkness beyond the ridge, a handful of riders emerged, 5, maybe 6. At their head rode Benson, his wide hat pulled low, his rifle glinting in the firelight. "Well, well," he called out, voice drunk on malice. "Ain't this a picture? Tanner playing hero to his squaw." Eli lifted his rifle, but Benson raised his first, the barrel steady. "Now you know better than that," Benson said. "Ain't no law says you can take what don't belong to your kind." Behind him, the men laughed, the kind of laughter that curdled the blood. Eli's voice came low and steady. "Turn around, Benson." "You've done enough," Benson sneered. "You talk like you still matter in this county." He leaned in his saddle, spitting to the ground. "She ain't yours, Tanner. Not by right, not by race. You want her? Then you're as much a fool as she is for thinking she belongs anywhere." The words hit like bullets, but Eli didn't flinch. His hand tightened on the rifle. Before he could speak, a sound split the night, a sharp single crack. Every man froze. Benson's horse reared, earth exploding just inches from its hooves. Smoke curled from the porch behind Eli's shoulder. Nalin stood there. Eli's rifle braced to her shoulder, her eyes cold and unshaken. Her voice carried across the burned field. Clear and strong. Next time, it won't be warning. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to hush. Benson's sneer faltered. He shifted in his saddle, face pale under the soot and flame glow. "You'll regret this," he spat, but his voice lacked its swagger. One by one, his men turned their horses. None looked back. Their retreat was slow, bitter, and final, like the dying embers they left behind. When they were gone, the night collapsed into exhaustion. Only the smell of smoke remained, thick, acrid, heavy as grief. Eli turned to Nalin. She stood still on the porch, the rifle lowering slowly from her shoulder. Her hands were raw and blistered, blood streaked down one wrist where a spark had caught. The lamplight flickered against her face, fierce and fragile all at once. "You could have killed him," Eli said quietly. "I would have," she answered, voice low. "If he touched you?" He didn't know what to say to that. The words were too much, and yet not enough. The fire behind them crackled low, dying in the wind. Around them, the land lay blackened and scarred. But through the ash, tiny embers still glowed, small, stubborn lights refusing to die. Eli looked at them, then at her. "Field'll heal," he said softly. "Takes time." Nalin's eyes glistened, reflecting that faint orange glow. "Maybe hearts too." Her voice broke on the last word. The rifle slipped from her hand, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. She covered her face with her palms, shoulders trembling. It wasn't fear that made her weep. Not anymore. It was everything else. The years of running, the loss, the silence, the unbearable relief of being alive and no longer alone. Eli stepped forward and did what he hadn't done in years, what he'd thought he'd forgotten how to do. He knelt beside her, soot and tears streaking both their faces, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, scraped, shaking. He didn't speak. He just held them. The sky above them, black and wide, began to pale at the edges. Dawn was still hours away, but already the stars seemed fewer, the horizon softer. In the glow of the dying fire, two souls sat amid the ruin, joined not by law or blood or even words, but by the simple, hard miracle of having survived together, Eli looked at her then, really looked. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the faint scar along her temple, the way her braid had half unraveled. She was no ghost, no symbol, no burden. She was life, fierce, flawed, and unyielding, and somewhere deep inside him, beneath the years of cold grief and silence, something thawed. He squeezed her hand once.
"Steady and sure. Reckon the land ain't the only thing needs rebuilding," he said. Nalin met his gaze, eyes rimmed red, yet shining.
"Then we start now." The words were simple, but they carried weight, like the promise of spring after a long, killing winter. And as the last flames flickered out, their warmth remained, quiet, steady, alive. The fire between them had burned through fear, leaving only truth. Spring crept in slow, like a secret the land was learning to trust again. The blackened field began to green at the edges, tender shoots pushing through the ash. The creek ran high with meltwater, whispering through the cottonwoods where Eli Tanner's wife and child lay buried. The air smelled of rain and renewal. Weeks had passed since the night of the fire. Benson's men kept their distance. Pride wounded, tempers cooled. No law came knocking, perhaps because Sheriff Grady had a way of losing certain papers when justice had already been served. Inside the cabin, the days took on a rhythm of quiet work. Eli mended the fences. Nalin planted early beans in the garden plot behind the house. She hummed as she worked, low, soft melodies without words, songs the wind seemed to recognize. At night they spoke more than before, though still little. Conversation between them was like the light, slow to rise, but warm once it came. He told her about the ranch as it once was, when laughter filled the rooms and a woman's shawl hung by the fire for warmth, not memory. She told him about the White Mountain country, her father's horses, the red clay cliffs where the world looked endless. One morning, as Eli was chopping wood, a rider appeared, a young Apache boy, barely 16. With feathers bound in his hair and dust on his face. He carried a message. The elders wished to see them both. Word had traveled fast, of Nalin's survival, of the fire, of the man who had stood beside her when others would not. Nalin stood silent for a long time after the boy left. Then she said quietly, "They will call it a debt." "Life for life." Eli looked at her. "That what it means? This right they speak of?" She nodded. "If a man saves a woman, her life becomes his. Some say it is honor. Others call it chain." He wiped his hands on his trousers, eyes fixed on the horizon. "And what do you call it?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes trembled. "I call it the past." They rode out 2 mornings later. The sky was pale with dawn, the air sharp with the last breath of winter. Nalin sat straight in the saddle, shawl drawn tight. Eli rode beside her, hat low against the wind. The trail wound through the foothills, past canyons that smelled of sage and sun-warmed stone. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them felt different now, not distance, but understanding. When they reached the Apache camp, it was near sundown. Smoke rose from the cooking fires. Children's laughter echoed through the cottonwoods. The scent of mesquite and roasted corn hung in the air. They were led to a circle near the central fire, where the elders sat waiting, old men with faces carved deep by wind and time, eyes sharp as arrowheads. Women stood behind them, shawls drawn, murmuring softly. Nalin dismounted first, moving with the grace of someone both honored and uncertain. Eli followed, hat in hand. The oldest of the elders spoke in Apache, his voice low and measured. Nalin translated quietly. "They say your act binds me to you. By the ancient law, my life belongs to you now." Eli swallowed hard, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Tell him I didn't save you to own you," she translated. The elder listened, unmoved. Eli took a breath, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but his heart beat like a drum in his chest. "Tell him this. I saved her life because no one should die alone. Not because I claim her." The fire popped. Smoke curled upward into the dusk, a thin gray thread between earth and sky. The elder stared at him a long while. His expression gave nothing away. He said something again, softer this time. Nalin turned to Eli. "He asks what I choose." She looked from the old man to Eli. the man who had carried her through fever and fire, who had said little and meant everything. The camp had fallen silent. Even the horses seemed to listen. Her voice came clear, unshaken. "I stay with him not by debt, by choice." The elder nodded once, slow and solemn. Then he lifted his hand to the fire and scattered a pinch of dust into the flames. The embers flared, glowing gold. "Then the bond is yours to keep or to break," he said in Apache. "Not the laws, the hearts." Nalin bowed her head. Eli did the same, and just like that, it was done. They left the next morning, the rising sun catching on the wet leaves, turning them silver. The road home stretched long and quiet, the kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. When the ranch came into view, the fence line rebuilt, the house standing steady under the cottonwoods, Eli felt something in his chest ease. Not joy exactly, something older, acceptance. The first thing Nalin did was gather water from the creek. She washed the soot-stained shawl and hung it on the porch rail to dry, where it swayed in the breeze like a flag of peace. Inside, Eli poured coffee into 2 cups and set one by the window seat. The smell filled the room, strong, familiar, grounding. "You ever think about leaving again?" he asked quietly. She looked out toward the green field, the mended fences, the distant mountains. "I've been leaving all my life," she said. "Maybe now I stay." He nodded, unable to speak. The wind picked up, rustling the cottonwoods. The old rocking chair creaked gently, as though remembering its purpose. Later, they sat together on the porch, him sharpening a tool, her braiding new rope with quiet patience. The sun dipped low, turning the sky to rose and gold. Neither reached for the other. They didn't have to. Their hands worked side by side, his scarred, hers still healing, each movement steady, each breath shared. The rhythm of 2 lives that had seen too much loss and finally found rest in the same place. Eli glanced toward the graves under the trees. For the first time in years, the sight didn't hollow him out. Instead, it filled him, as if those he'd lost were part of this piece too. Nalin followed his gaze. "You talk to them sometimes?" "Every day," he said softly. "What do they say back?" He smiled faintly. "That I ought to keep living." She nodded, eyes shining in the fading light. "Then we do." Night settled gentle over the land. The stars came out, bright as fresh-forged silver. From the porch, the sound of the rocking chair rose again, slow, steady, alive. The ghosts had gone quiet at last, and in their place, 2 souls sat beneath the endless sky, no longer bound by loss or law, only by the quiet, human grace of having chosen each other. The world was still. The land breathed. The story had come full circle, and somewhere in that vast New Mexico night, the wind carried a single truth across the plains, that love, when earned through fire and silence, can outlast even the desert itself.